You have a question?
He wants a lap.
I want to ask this question before you even start talking to us. Apple trees, pear trees, peach trees, they're all natural trees, right?
Unnatural.
Unnatural.
Okay.
No, they're natural.
Okay, they're natural.
Okay,
His brain is shut down.
Why all this work? Can't they be just left alone to do their thing in nature?
So the apple tree, the fruit tree, wants to grow a delectable enough fruit so that you, or a camel, or a donkey, or a horse, or what have you, moves it along, eats it, it comes out the other end and becomes a tree, and thus spreads. And so, in the case, I think of all these fruits, you know, it was that region of Central Asia where they derived, and the amount of diversity available in Kazakhstan and places like that is a lot different than what we've worked with here. So we have taken these fruits and we have said we really prefer the sweeter ones. We really prefer the ones that get really good size. So when we make some of these choices and we do breeding with varieties that favor those characteristics, we've gotten away from some of the resistance mechanisms. So there are varieties that have some resistance to disease. There was an apple in the early 1900s, a Malus floribunda, that did not get apple scab. And they started crossing that particular apple with other varieties to create what we now call scab immune varieties. So if you grow something like Liberty or Freedom, you are growing an apple that has a genetic resistance mechanism to scab. And when that fungal hyphae penetrates a cell, the cell that's penetrated self-destructs. And this is due to something called the VF gene. And this never worked. We could never take these varieties and plant them in Europe because scab was a little different there. And other ones of these immune varieties are the, if you see PRI in the name, that stands for Purdue, Rutgers, and Illinois universities. And that's where this research was done in breeding these varieties. So if you're growing Prima, or Priscilla, or Williams Pride, others like that, you see that PRI, or Gold Rush, there's other varieties as well. They all have this mechanism. Well, this is really cool. So everything evolves to deal with how we've changed things and made things different. And about 5 years ago at Purdue University, where this research was done, starting with this tree that they discovered in like 1908, that very mother tree got scab because scab changed and it became like the scab in Europe. And so now in different parts of this country, scab is also changing. And part of that has been made possible by the fact that we have grown trees susceptible to scab right next to these immune varieties. We've sprayed for scab on the trees susceptible, but not the immune varieties, and so scab reacted to that. And so that mechanism shifted. Now there's other trees that have more broader resistance, and this takes me back to Kazakhstan. We skipped over some of those varieties. We're now going back there to breed in some of those resistance mechanisms that we left behind when we said we really like sweet big apples. And so maybe in the future we'll get back to more what you're referring to as a natural apple. The other thing that's shifted is how we manage the landscape. So when I talk about emphasizing biodiversity and talk about taprooted plants and the beneficials, a lot of fruit trees don't have those advantages. They're not being grown with the kind of a consciousness of all that. So here we have that. Yet you deal with scab, you lose fruit to cuculio. I just accept the fact that even when you understand where health comes from and you can do so much to create that fungal dominance and good plant metabolism, there are just some years where insect pressures are so high or the rain patterns are such that it's constantly wet and fungal disease is just no drying out. And we're going to have those years. You know, some degree of spotting on fruit is actually good. You all know the saying, an apple a day will keep the doctor away. So that was just a marketing slogan from the 1800s. And since then, the Florida Orange Juice Council got a lot more clever than the apple growers. Anyway, that saying actually has some validity in understanding that we are a species that evolved eating the fruits that grew in the wild, the nuts that grew in the wild, the occasional mastodon. And it's in that diet of a living soil system fruit that our bodies found certain constituents in the fruit that helped quell degenerative disease. So today, most of our apples do not come from living soil systems. So those apples you go and buy at Hannaford's or Shaw's, maybe it's 64 apples a day will keep the doctor away. Maybe it's 189 apples a day. I don't know. But between the heavy use of fungicides, telling the apple, you don't need to produce those phytochemicals because we'll take care of you with the medicine. Well, those phytochemicals, the antioxidants, that's what we evolved with. That's what helps our bodies thwart degenerative diseases. And so it's all interrelated. How we grow the fruit has a big role here. And we've made a lot of choices that have really gotten us away from the fruit forest of Kazakhstan, both genetically and in terms of the ecosystem around it. So you can go off the deep end and write books about all this and come and give talks about it and do all these things mostly. But you'll also find you whittle it down. And I said some really key words today. Biodiversity. The fact that it's a fungal-dominated soil ecosystem. We've talked about how to achieve that. Ideally, we don't have to do the sprays. I'd love to figure out Cuculio a little bit better so we don't have to do the clay spray. It's white. It's really not that pretty. It has ramifications if it's overdone. But right now, we're at a point where this is the cutting edge of what we understand. It's better than it was 20 years ago. I have no reason to doubt that we're going to not keep improving on it. And thus, we have the unnatural apple tree. Yes.
My two apple trees are not getting a lot of light, and they're about four years old. I'm just wondering, have you ever heard of anybody moving apple trees?
Yes. So 4 years old doesn't strike me as that daunting. The bigger the root ball, the better. I have a friend, Nick Coles at Shelburne Orchards up near Burlington, Vermont, who when he plants trees, actually plants a few rows at double the amount of trees he wants in that row. And he grows them out for about 10, 12 years. And then there are so many people who are willing to pay $500, $600 a tree to have him dig these somewhat mature trees out with a backhoe and move them to their site. So absolutely, you can do it. It's the less you can destroy the root system.
Big enough excavator bucket, you can do it. I've moved some pretty big trees. You just have to have a big scoop.
Okay.
I've been pretty successful.
Good, okay. I'll tell my husband.
Tell him to buy an excavator.
Yeah.
He won't argue with you.
Oh, he argues with me, all right.
Can you tell me what a Bordeaux mixture is? Does that include the effective microbes?
No.
No. Do you ever use it?
Not anymore. So Bordeaux mixture is actually copper sulfate and hydrated lime.
Okay.
And it actually came about this way. This was before, as human beings, we understood that we could spray certain things on the plants and somewhat thwart disease. And somewhere in the 1800s, French grape growers in the Bordeaux region were really rather frustrated by all the people going up and down the country lanes thinking they could just come into their vineyards and eat their grapes and not pay for them. And so they got pissed off enough that they decided, well, if we can't have them, we're just going to make them unpalatable. And they took copper sulfate and made everything blue, tasted metallic. But in doing that, they discovered that, hey, there's no disease now in these grapes because copper, it's that piano dropping. And then they recognized, I don't know what it took, but by mixing hydrated lime with it, it was a little less phytotoxic to the plant. So Bordeaux mixture is a copper-based fungicide. It has a neat history, but it's still very impactful in terms of the ecosystem.
Okay.
I burned you out. This is your chance to ask about what do I do with this big overgrown tree. This is your chance to all those possible questions.
I just wondered what would be your preference for cider apples up in this region?
So when we say the word cider to a purist, that is
I'm meaning something tart with,
that is the fermented drink of the apple. Just like when you hear the word wine, you know that's the fermented drink of the grape. So in America, we use the term hard cider and sweet cider.
I'm meaning hard cider.
Okay, good.
Now we're talking.
That time.
So when you make a hard cider, as a growing fruit for your family, you're going to grow a number of dessert varieties. They tend to be somewhat acidic. Then there are certain varieties like the Golden Russet or the Ashmead's Kernel that have more of a balance between sugars and acidity. But even when you're tuned in to like mixing some aromatics with some bitter apples and sweet apples and sub-acid apples, the acidic levels usually still are a little bit high. So it's useful in growing the fruit that you want to eat and store and make sweet cider with, to also raise a bittersweet tree or two. So here's where you get into the Red Streak or the Chisel Jersey or the Dabonet. These are British cider varieties. And a bittersweet is something that is very low. It's a low acid apple, and it has the tannins, and it's that portion of the juice that leads to a nicer hard cider, a nicer cider. So you can grow many of the same apples, and the more you grow late season apples, or the ones that ripen in October into November, they make the best cider in general, I think. And if you have that bittersweet aspect, and you may find that in a wild apple, or you may grow something like Tolman Sweet, which is an old-fashioned sweet apple. It's not really high sugar, it's low acid. But you have to usually lower the acid level of your juice to get the kind of fine cider I really like. And more people are getting into that.
What about crab apples as a hard cider? Not knowing anything, I looked through the FEDCO catalog and they're recommending Dolgo crab apple as an excellent cider, hard cider apple. And it's also a good pollinator for all apples, which is another reason I chose it.
I've heard that. I haven't tried it.
I haven't. It's only.
I have not pressed any Dogo in a mix, so I don't know that aspect. But there are small apples that make extremely good cider. So when we're talking about things like the Virginia Hughes crab or the Harrison apple, a lot of people use that word crab apple to just kind of reflect a small apple. Mm-hmm. That's kind of a vague term. There's an apple called the Wixen, which is a cross between the Newton Pippin and the Sophus Spitzenberg. And both of those, one's a big yellow apple, one's a fairly big red apple. But together, their genetics led to a small apple we call the Wixen. That's an excellent cider apple because of its balance of sugar and acidity. So crab apples tend to have more of that balance aspect. But that's not written in stone about every crab apple. And I don't know about Dogo at all in that respect. And we should be drinking cider now if we're going to go to
Where is it?
Where's the bottle?
Is there a keg
Talk
in the
just for a
shed?
minute about a strategy. I've got several of them that I've started on, but you buy a piece of property and there are 6 or 8 apple trees on it, let's say, that nobody's touched. We don't know. They're all overgrown. They've got a lot of deadwood in them. I mean, my strategy is going, first of all, and just start deadwooding. I really have just deadwooded them for a year and just let them sit and see where they go from there. And then kind of start working them from there. And I'm probably taking it slower than I need to, maybe, but...
Right, so the deadwood is, you're not removing any part of the leaf canopy in that step. And in a given pruning season, you can remove as much as a third of the canopy. I mean, there are people who cut a tree down and it regrows. So, in one sense, you could do worse. But when I go into a tree, and not so much these first two, but those in the back, I think, are more like what you're talking about. One decision is, the notion of a central leader, that was left behind years ago. No one ever trained that tree, and it probably has multiple leaders. And there's nothing wrong with that. The fact that an unpruned tree gets to be 25, 30, 35 foot tall. There's actually nothing wrong with that either, but you may want to bring it down if you're trying to get more production, just because it's more, you're able to work with it more than when it's way up in the sky. So when I go into such a tree, I am looking for 3 or 4 big cuts that structurally aren't necessarily going to get me all the way back to a central leader, but are going to get some of that notion of a tree not having these really tall suckers that have become like a tree in its own right on top of the lower portion of the tree. So in removing those, that usually gets me to that third of the branches I want to remove. And I'm not getting into thinning or thinking about throwing the cow between the branches now. I'm just bringing the tree down and starting to tame it. And as a result of those bigger cuts, there's usually going to be quite a lot of water sucker action that first growing season. And if you go in there in early August and you remove about 85% of those suckers, the more vigorous ones, that timing is going to be less of a vegetative boost than it would be if you wait till next spring. So that's helping the tree to stay a little calmer through this change. And the next round of cuts, at this point I'm visualizing that I've dropped the tree a little bit. I can see a spreading structure within that jungle. Now I'm looking for, again, bigger cuts, but ones that kind of thin it out so there's this concept of a branch occupies this light space, but there's not 2 branches sharing it. So I'm getting more of like what this tree looks and feels like, or this tree. And it's over the course of 2 or 3 years that you go through that process and get to a point where the tree is back into production. So if you overdo it and you don't deal with water sprouts, you might be several years growing water sprouts.
I did the one, and I kind of did that. I went in and made some big cuts, and I opened it up a little bit, and then I got nothing on it the next year, so I kind of panicked and I backed off. Somewhat, and went back to just deadwooding. But yeah, okay.
Well, part of nothing is a vegetative response. So that's where I'm referring to the pruning cuts. But part of nothing is also, was there a heavy crop the year you did those cuts? And what we talked about when we talked about thinning, maybe no flower cells are even going to be there whether you did nothing. So it isn't that pruning cut that's going to really change that. And then another thing that's hard for me to grasp when people bring up the question of Fukuoka and the idea of not pruning, that it's more natural to not prune the tree. It's hard for me to grasp that because of what I've described in terms of like the peach going further and further out. Or what you see on a wild tree is the canopy gets thicker and thicker. It gets too shaded in the middle. That's why branches die. And it eventually gets kind of spur-bound. So those, instead of new wood, it just keeps having fruit on the same spurs for 20, 30 years. The fruit starts to get smaller. There's reasons why we prune. And it's principally getting light into the interior so that the tree doesn't go further and further out. It's partly space between branches, so there's drying breezes. And it's partly, yes, there's a permanent part of the tree structure, but off of that comes young wood, like the water sprout I bent over in the plum or the cherry tree. I encourage that young wood to eventually replace the older laterals on a branch so that I have youthful spurs, which give me the more vigorous fruit.
We talked a lot about apples and some of the other kind of more common orchard species. What are other fruit varieties you think that are promising for like the home scale growers in New Hampshire? Like Asian pear or things that are maybe a little easier?
Different.
So Asian pear is a good one. You know, it's one you have to be aggressive at thinning in order to grow nice sized fruit. Just like the European pear, it doesn't have the same insect pressure. It's just, we don't have whatever pests might bother it in its native land. They're not here. You will see some damage, but not near the same degree, and it usually will result in fruit scarring and not the loss of the fruit. And the diseases just aren't here either to afflict that. It's not subject to pear scab that I know of. Asian pears can get fire blight, but we're in a cooler place currently. And So that's a choice. The bush cherries are a good choice. I know you have a pawpaw here. You were telling me about this little struggling pawpaw about to take off. Lee Reich has a book, The Uncommon Fruits. I'm growing some red currants. I like currants a lot. There's quite a range of different fruits, and as you read about it, it's easy to get excited about fitting more and more things into your landscape. I like the Fedco Tree Catalog as a resource that starts to share some of these different potential things to explore, from honeyberries to aronia, and there's more cultivated service berries, and there's huckleberries, and there's many things that you can go for. I don't know, someone else might have something to add to this list.
I had a question or something else.
I got another question for you.
I'll go there.
So I have a Spitzenberg and a Pelvis Blondie apple, and so they're early varieties that have been less frequently grown and they're coming back kind of. Does that mean they have a little more resistance, or not really?
What was the second one?
A French apple called Pelvis Blondie
Okay.
goes back to 1648 or something.
So when an apple seed grows, wherever it first grows, and if that tree that results is productive, has a nice flavorful fruit, and typically showed some resistance to the pressures in that area, people started to favor it, and it came to have a name. And so I don't remember the lineage of Spitzenberg, and the Calville is a much older apple. But then we go and we move it to new ecosystems. And not only that, but 2 centuries pass, a century passes. So had you planted any apple on this farm in the year 1750 or before, Cuculio wouldn't have bothered it whatsoever. It was content in the native plum thickets. But once apples were planted here, and the other fruits that we grow, and it recognized, hey, I can do that one. I can do that one too. I'm going to do that one too. And so that changed. Codling moth was not on this continent in like 1700. That came when we started to move more produce around the world. So things have shifted, and what I've just described in terms of scab evolving, that has shifted as well. So yes, an heirloom probably showed some resistance mechanisms where it was first grown, but we've shifted the context. Sometimes going back to those heirlooms has virtue. It can grow in other places and show some of that. There are apple varieties. One of the ones I mentioned last night was a Connie, which is a bright red apple. And its parentage is Worcester Pearmain, which is an apple that doesn't just have that singular resistance to scab, but it resists scab and it resists rust, and it has a broader genetics for resisting disease. And that goes back to your question about the Kazakhstan natural apples. So there are genetics out there that are part of what we can work with, but the biggest thing we can influence is the ecosystem, the soil, and all the connections I talked about today. So it's worth exploring, especially if you really love the Spitzenberg, and it is an incredible apple, and the Calville is also really nice. But you're not necessarily going to have less issues. Like Jefferson really liked Spitzenberg. It's a New York apple. He brought it to Virginia. He could hardly grow it. It had so many disease issues, but that was changing the context.
How do you keep the deer population listening? Your apples.
There's a 6-foot-high, 8-wire electric high tensile fence around my orchard.
Seriously.
6 foot did it?
They can jump as much as 12 feet if they're spooked, but between things like baiting the hot wire with peanut butter on foil so they lick it,
Yeah, torture. Yeah, but that's the way electric fence works. You really need to train animals to the...
it is possible for the deer, and the young ones particularly, somehow one figures out that if you leap through 2 hot wires, you don't get shocked because you're not grounded. I mean, I don't think they mentally can, but they recognize, hey, if you leap. So in the winter, you have to alternate hot wire, cold wire. is part of it. And one year, I had 2 fawns. This will be like a confession. I didn't hurt the deer, though, so hold on to the end of the story. I had 2 fawns that had learned this, and they were destroying my new block of trees. And the mother didn't know. She just walked around and around the fence. So I'd go out at night with a gun, and I just never saw them, intercepted them. That's how that typically works. And so my friend told me that his cousin was trapping the Vermont coyotes that were coming across the frozen Connecticut River to feed on the dead cows from an industrial dairy farm where a cow dies every day. Anyway, in trapping him, he was removing the skins and making a pile of frozen carcasses out back of his woodshed. So we brought a pickup load of frozen coyote carcasses that I hung all around my orchard. And within 24 hours, there were no deer found within the valley. And come spring, I knew I had to get out there before the thaw to deal with that. But that's just an example of, like, sometimes you go into this extreme space because you really want to grow fruit and do things you can't imagine.
How would you increase your orchard? Would you buy rootstock and graft on that, or would you buy bigger trees? What would be a sensible way to do that?
Well, it depends on the number of trees you're growing and the varieties you want. So if you're really into particular rootstock and particular varieties that are outside of the trade, you probably have to learn to graft yourself. And grafting involves investing a year or 2 or 3 in the tree in the nursery. So there's some patience there. If you are visualizing expanding on the scale of like 100 or 200 trees, you can get a nursery like Cummings Nursery to custom graft certain varieties on certain roots, and the economics are there. But it's partly economic based, but it's also, it's not an instant thing. You have to put in a couple of years if you're doing your own grafting. On the other hand, if I come in here and I top work, take branches and bark graft, and this would have been about 2-3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago would have been the ideal time. That's how I create that multi-variety tree. And when I graft a rootstock on a more vigorous root, it might be 7, 8, 9 years till I get a fruit to taste it. But when I graft it onto a bearing tree, often within 3 years, you'll have fruit from that graft, which is a neat way to test, A, do I like the variety? B, does that variety work where I'm living in my climate?
Yeah.
But if you're just thinking of adding 3 trees, then maybe just simply buying 3 trees from Fedco is the way to go.
Yeah.
I mean, it depends on the scale.
I did that with an older tree. I was going to take it out. It didn't seem like it was bearing at all. And then I think I might have read in your book to do that, to put 3 or 4 different grafts on, and I did, and some of them seemed to take, so it makes sense.
This isn't about apples, but with I was wondering if you feel comfortable planting raspberries or maybe some other stone fruit with the new pressure, the spotted wing, the Trucier.
The spotted wing Dropsophilia fly. So right now we are at a place where I don't think they're overwintering around here yet. And I may be wrong, and I'm not sure where someone told me they also overwinter in the forest. We're just starting to learn about that. But this is a fly that by midsummer comes on pretty strong. So in a place like Oregon, where they came first, they're afflicting the blueberries in early summer. But here, we have to have them wind blown in. So if I wanted to grow raspberries, right now, the June-bearing ones probably have better odds than the fall-bearing ones, even though the fall-bearing ones are a little easier to manage in that you get fruit off one-year canes. But last year, I had them at my farm. And, you don't notice it for the first couple generations as just a few and fruit's immature. But then as it starts to ripen and you start to picking and you suddenly see a cloud, well, my approach was 1 spray of entrust. I didn't eat the fruit. I picked it off. You try to destroy the drops. And in this climate where the nights got cold pretty quick thereafter, it didn't rebound. Other places people have to do alternate sprays of entrust and pyganic, and they may do like 8-9 sprays, and that's just not really worth it. But this is a challenging one, and we're just learning about it. And
for some of the earlier season varieties?
One of the things I will tell you that I think is really hopeful is there's this guy named Bob Wiltz, who's a Oregon blueberry grower. And he has a couple of videos up on the web about how he grows his fruit. And he will talk about how he has taprooted plants in the aisle as part of his fertility loop and for beneficial species. He will talk about making compost tea and spraying liquid fish and how those nutrient sprays up the bricks on his plants. And then he will tell you about how he sees this vinegar fly. His neighbors are devastated by it, but his high bricks blueberries, which are grown not in an out-and-out acidic soil, but with a more normal pH, but with an acidic interface. I talk about that in the book. His fruit has a higher bricks, and the vinegar fly is not drawn to it. You know, that's the theory and practice, what I started this morning talking about plant metabolism. So you are going to get a plant less preferred. Can we get it enough? I don't know. He seems to be. But I think that's hopeful. It's speaking to the nutrient path as a way to go, and that makes total sense to me. It too, this vinegar fly is a symptom. And when we get the health right, and we get the pieces in place, we're not going to have those pest pressures to the same degree.
What was his name again?
Bob Wiltz, and I think his farm might be like Sunset Organics, but his name is like Wilts. I'm pretty sure on his name, not so sure on his farm name.
Well,
The cider.
all right, so everybody's worn out? You had enough?
I guess.
He wins. All right.
Yeah, he's buying drinks for all of us.
I will pour cider for all of you. You just have to come an hour and a half north.
What's that?
Eel.
What'd you say?
It's up
He
Lancaster
come drink with
Groveton
him
area
up
of New
Oh, good.
Hampshire.
Well, all right, folks, so we'll call it a day. Woohoo!
Yeah.
There's
I'm
still
excited.
some tea across the street if people want
You're
some
welcome.
tea. And
Open a bottle of hard cider.
there's one bottle of hard cider Regina's willing to share.